The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. We expect a very lengthy hearing today, but we also know that there are several other committees meeting, as well as floor votes today. Our hearing today focuses on the implementation of positive train control, PTC, in the United States. It is an especially important hearing as yesterday marked the 10th anniversary of the tragic Chatsworth accident. This important life-saving technology is one of the most complex safety mandates ever undertaken by the railroad industry. PTC is a radio or GPS-based system designed to prevent train-to-train collisions over speed derailments, incursions into work zones, and the movement of a train through a switch left in the wrong position. From its inception a decade ago, Congress and stakeholders anticipated the PTC mandate would be a daunting undertaking. It has been implemented on such a large scale and has never required such a high level of interoperability. Since the 2008 mandate was enacted and the 2015 bipartisan extension was passed, freight, passenger, and commuter railroads have been working to implement PTC. We've seen a great deal of progress from freight rails as well as commuter rails across the entire country. But we've still seen challenges. We've still seen accidents. We've been had promises made to us as a committee that haven't been met. And we held a hearing earlier this year. He and I have been very united on this topic, and we asked the entire industry, if there's something you need, let us know. If it's funding, if it is a technical rule, whatever the issue is, because we've got a very, very large country with very unique circumstances and different rails across the entire country in different positions as far as implementation. We've consulted several times to ask each other, what have the rails come up with? Has anybody asked for extensions? Anybody asking for money or grants? And so, as you'll see in this committee hearing, I would expect the patience is growing thin on actual PTC implementation. That's why we called this to hear from all of you. So it is a critical issue for our country, especially as we've continued to see some accidents for a variety of different reasons, but most of which would be solved if we had PTC in place. With that, I yield to the ranking member, Mr. Capuano.
I agree with everything the chairman just said, 100%. I also want to state that from what I see, there has been a lot of progress made. So I want to be clear about that. From the way I look at it, there's a few people who are lagging behind, which actually I think proves the point that there's no reason to be lagging behind because most everybody is doing their job. So I just want to be real clear. For those who are doing their job, thank you. I appreciate it. A long time coming, and it's finally happening. For those of you who are not, understand it's going to be very difficult to make an argument that for some reason everybody else could do it except you. It's going to be almost impossible as far as I'm concerned. And I do say again that when that time comes, there'll be nobody to point a finger at anymore. There'll be no more bottom lines on whether it was worth the money to not do PTC and possibly risk lives or property. Those days are over. And again, most of you get it. And I want to be real clear. Because of that, we get upset on occasion, but I also want to be real clear. Most companies have done it. Most public entities have done it or are on the way to doing it. The handful who are not, I'm just saying very clearly, be careful. Because I don't think you're going to find very many, if any, open minds on this side of the table when you come to say, for some reason, every other person except us could get their job done, particularly at this late date. With that, I'm going to yield back.
Now recognize the full committee chairman, Mr. Schuster.
Thank you, Chairman Denham. Thanks for holding this hearing. And I just want to echo the concerns that the chairman and the ranking member have about PTC. I'd like to point out, though, further, we're talking about who's doing and who's not doing. And I want to say, I know that my reports that I've seen is the freight rails are all in position to deploy, and it's the commuter rails and the other smaller entities out there that seem to be holding this up. And as the chairman said, there's been concerns. We've reached out, asked what the needs are, and time again, it's either been we've not got a response back or everything's okay. And as I said, it's concerning. When we in 2015 unanimously voted to extend it, we did it because we thought that everybody would step up their game and get to a point where we'd see PTC being deployed. So again, it's as the ranking member said, it's not everybody. What I've seen, again, I'll emphasize the freight rails seem to be doing what they're supposed to be doing and need to move forward, and that interoperability is the piece that doesn't seem to be there. They can't do what they need to do to fully implement the PTC. So again, this hearing is important. Safety is absolutely critical to this committee when it comes to all modes of transportation. So I look forward to hearing everybody's testimony today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Now recognize Mr. DeFazio for any statement he may make.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this important hearing. Yeah, I hope, like the speakers before me, to hear about how we are going to meet the statutory deadlines of 18 and full utilization by 20. You know, I'm concerned at some of those at the rear of the pack, as Ranking Member Capuano mentioned. There is no feasible excuse that isn't, you know, for this committee or for the agency. I am concerned, and Ranking Member Capuano, Congressman Cohen, and Congressman Cooper and I sent a letter to the FRA after they exempted the Music City Star, a permanent exemption from PTC. You know, and I understand there's another railroad that's pending. I hope to hear from Administrator Vittori on this. You know, Congress did not authorize exemptions to PTC. I find that nowhere in the law. And, you know, this causes me concern that some will look at this, look at the exemption, the one granted, the one potentially in process, and say, well, there's our out. You know, we're way behind schedule here. So, you know, this is not something that Congress anticipated. And, you know, I look forward to hearing how FRA might revise the process in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. DeFazio. I'd like to welcome each of our witnesses here today. Our panel is comprised of the Honorable Ron Vittori, Administrator of Federal Railroad Administration, FRA, Honorable Robert Zumwalt, Chairman, National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, Susan Fleming, Director of the Physical Infrastructure Team, Government Accountability Office, Scott Naparstek, Executive Vice President and COO of Amtrak, Ed Hamburger, President and CEO of the Association of American Railroads, Jeff Nappel, General Manager, Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority on behalf of the American Public Transportation Association, and Stacy Mortensen, Executive Director of the Altamont Corridor Express, or ACE train. I ask unanimous consent that our witnesses' full statements be included in the record without objection so ordered. Since your written statement has been made part of the record, the subcommittee would request that you limit your testimony to 5 minutes. Mr. Vittori, you're recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Denham, Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member Capuano, Ranking Member DeFazio, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today to discuss positive train control, better known as PTC. I come to my position as Administrator of the Federal Railroad Administration with 45 years of experience in the railroad industry. Throughout my career, I've continually focused on improving safety performance, and I bring the same commitment to the FRA. Secretary Chow and myself have made railroads' implementation of PTC the top FRA agenda. 41 railroads are required to implement PTC systems, and that includes all 7 Class I freight railroads, 30 commuter and intercity passenger railroads, including Amtrak, and 4 short line and terminal switching railroads. This technology is required to be implemented on approximately 58,000 miles of the 140,000-mile rail network. While railroads are making progress, FRA expects that most railroads will need to request an alternative schedule to complete testing, obtain system certification, and meet interoperability requirements. This summer, for the first time in agency history, the FRA hosted 3 symposiums for the to-be-compliant railroads. Each of the day-long sessions brought together railroad safety officials and FRA's PTC experts to ensure that each railroad subject to the mandate is aware of its obligations and its equipment to meet the deadline. These meetings discussed industry questions and lessons learned, requirements for the December 31st, 2018 deadline, along with best practices for testing and safety plans. Since April 2016, FRA has tracked individual railroads' self-reporting implementation. Based on the railroad's most recent reports, PTC systems are in operation on 66% of the freight railroads' required route mileage. Passenger railroads have made less progress, with PTC systems in operation on 24% of what is required. The most recent data also showed a reduction in the number of railroads FRA considers to be at risk of not qualifying for an alternative schedule. From 12 railroads in April of 2018 to 9 in August of this year, FRA currently considers any railroad that has installed less than 90% of its system hardware as of June 30th to be of most risk of failing to qualify for an alternative schedule. It is important to note that the installation of all PTC system hardware is only one of 6 criteria required to qualify for an alternative schedule to complete full PTC system implementation after December 31st, 2018. The 9 at-risk railroads are New Mexico Rail Runner, Cap Metro, New Jersey Transit, Altamont, Corridor Express, MARC, and Trinity Railway Express, and Tri-Rail, Caltran, and Sunrail. FRA is in frequent communication and providing additional on-site technical assistance to further assist these railroads. Over the next several months, FRA expects to receive and review requests for railroads' alternative schedules beyond December 31st, 2018 deadline. By law, FRA has 90 days to review and issue a decision to approve or deny the alternative schedule. FRA expects to receive many of the requests before the end of the year and will review the extension request in January through March of 2019. If a railroad fails to qualify and receive FRA approval for an alternative schedule, FRA is authorized to assess monetary penalties. PTC is designed to provide important risk reduction protocols to enhance existing safety, but these systems come with significant costs. Since 2008, FRA has awarded $961 million in grant funding to support railroads' implementation. More recently, on August 24 of this year, FRA selected 28 PTC projects, including 13 commuter railroads, to receive $203 million under the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Grant Program. Of the $203 million announced, $80 million in grants, or 39%, was announced for at-risk railroads. Since 2008, a total of $2.5 billion in grants and loans has been allocated to the railroads to assist with PTC implementation. In an effort to show FRA continued commitment to PTC implementation, we reissued a notice of funding opportunity for the remaining 46%, or $46 million, in grants. Similar to the previous issued NOFO, this is an expedited solicitation with a 30-day application period. Applications from applicants will be due October 12th. Looking forward to the rest of this year and into 2019, FRA will continue to support and facilitate railroads' implementation of PTC by utilizing the tools afforded by Congress and providing extensive technical assistance. I appreciate the committee's support for our programs and look forward to your safety-oriented questions.
Thank you. Mr. Sumwall?
Good morning, Chairman Schuster, Chairman Denham, Ranking Member DeFazio, Ranking Member Capuano, and members of the subcommittee. As Chairman Denham indicated, yesterday marked the 10-year anniversary of the tragedy at Chatsworth. That accident killed 25 people, injured over 100, many with life-altering injuries. And of course, in the aftermath of that accident, Congress mandated PTC through the Rail Safety Improvement Act of 2008. Now, here we are, 10 years later, and nearly 3 years after the original deadline mandated by Congress, and we still do not have PTC fully implemented in the United States. Is that acceptable? It's certainly not acceptable to the NTSB. Since Chatsworth, we have investigated 22 accidents that could have been prevented by PTC. And these accidents resulted in 29 deaths, over 500 injuries, and property costs in excess of $190 million. The NTSB strongly urges swift implementation of the congressional PTC mandate. That said, it's important to note that even after that mandate is met, significant portions of the nation's rail network will not have PTC. And according to reports submitted by the railroads to FRA, only about 40% of the nation's rail network will have PTC. And of significant concern as it relates to Amtrak, there are over 1,400 miles of mainline track that Amtrak currently operates on that will not have PTC. And if Amtrak continues to operate on those segments, there will be a diminished level of safety for those passengers and train crews who are traveling through communities such as Topeka, Kansas, Grand Junction, Colorado, Portland, Maine, Memphis, Tennessee, New Orleans, St. Louis, and many others. In other cases, under its regulations, the FRA has approved exemptions to the PTC requirement for other mainline tracks on which not only freight, but also intercity passenger and commuter railroads operate. Again, this means there will be a significant diminished level of safety for passengers who are traveling on those railroads. Earlier this year, an Amtrak passenger train collided with a standing CSX freight train in Casey, South Carolina. An operational PTC system could have prevented that accident. This is the second accident that we have investigated involving a train being unexpectedly diverted onto a sidetrack because of a switch being left in the wrong position in an area of track under signal suspension due to installation and testing of PTC. When I testified before this committee in February in the aftermath of that Casey accident, I told you about an urgent safety recommendation that we had issued that day, which called on the FRA to order railroads to implement operational measures needed to ensure safe operation in areas where PTC is being installed and tested. Now, I want to point out that we only issue urgent safety recommendations when we determine that the course of action requires immediate attention to avoid imminent loss. And here we are, 7 months later, and the FRA has not issued such an order, and the recommendation is currently classified by the NTSB as open, unacceptable response. And I think that the classification of that recommendation in an unacceptable status speaks for itself. We are concerned with the lack of action by the FRA. The NTSB is also concerned that 10 years after Chatsworth, most railroads are still not ready. And let me spell that out. For every day that we go without PTC, we are at risk for another Chatsworth, another Bronx, another Amtrak in Philadelphia, another DuPont, another Casey, South Carolina. Each of these were mass casualty events due to human error, accidents that could have been prevented by PTC. And I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. Thank you for holding this hearing, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Sumwalt. Ms. Fleming, you recognize.
Chairman Schuster and Denham, ranking members DeFazio and Capuano, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss railroads implementation and FRA's oversight of PTC, one of the most promising technological advances in rail safety in decades. As you know, GAO has been closely tracking and reporting on railroads and FRA's PTC efforts since 2010. Although railroads and FRA have made some progress in certain areas, it has been slow. And in light of the implementation and other challenges, we have consistently cautioned that some railroads may not meet required deadlines. We are now fast approaching the December 31st, 2018 deadline for railroads to either fully implement PTC or seek an extension of up to 2 years. My testimony today focuses on two issues: the progress that railroads required to implement PTC have made and FRA's efforts to assist them, and how railroads and FRA plan to approach the December 2018 and 2020 deadlines. With respect to railroads' progress, we found that many railroads remained in the early implementation stages, meaning equipment installation and initial field testing. Equipment installation presents a more positive picture. Half of railroads were still installing equipment on trains and alongside tracks. However, nearly 3/4 reported being more than 90% done. Progress varied more widely with respect to testing. All of the Class 1 freights and Amtrak had initiated field testing and entered the latter stage of advanced testing known as Revenue Service Demonstration, or RSD. By contrast, 19 commuter railroads and 2 Class 2 and 3 freight railroads had initiated field testing, and only 8 commuter railroads and no Class 2 or 3 had initiated RSD. Initiating RSD is important for 2 reasons. First, it allows railroads to test trains operating PTC as part of their regular operations. Second, unless commuter or Class 2 or 3 freights receive FRA approval to use substitute criteria, they must initiate RSD by year-end to qualify for an extension. In this regard, FRA's recent clarification about substitute criteria may lessen concerns, at least in the near term, about the number of railroads that had yet to initiate RSD. In 3 symposia this summer, FRA officials explained that initiated field testing could potentially qualify as substitute criteria. Consistent with our recommendation, FRA also clarified other aspects of its planned approach for reviewing and granting extensions. Railroad representatives welcomed this information, though a few wish FRA had shared it much sooner. Turning to this year's deadline, as of August, 8 railroads anticipate reaching full implementation by December. The remaining 32 said they plan to apply for an extension. To date, only 1 had done so. 16 said they intend to use substitute criteria. For those railroads that failed to meet either year-end requirement, FRA officials said that the levying of civil fines is a yet-to-be-made policy decision and will take into account specific circumstances. Given that applying for an extension appears to be the general approach rather than the exception to the upcoming deadline, much work will need to be accomplished to achieve full PTC implementation in the final 2-year window. Many railroads will need to either initiate or complete field testing. To date, moving from field testing to RSD has taken railroads on average 2 years to complete. And about 1/4 of the railroads told us that they had encountered software bugs or other challenges related to the maturity of the system. Moreover, interoperability remains a great unknown. Almost all railroads implementing PTC share track with at least one other railroad and therefore must ensure their PTC systems operate with each other. This poses a particular challenge for Class 1 freight railroads, especially in dense areas such as Chicago, where 14 different railroads interoperate. While Class 1s are in the latter stages of implementation, they cannot begin interoperability testing until their tenant railroads fully implement PTC. In turn, FRA's already substantial workload will increase. FRA has reallocated some internal resources and begun reviewing draft documents to help address the upcoming surge of anticipated submissions. One of the last documents railroads must submit is their safety plan. As of July, 34 railroads had yet to do so. FRA officials estimated that each safety plan would take 6 months to 1 year to review. Prioritizing resources based on risk will continue to be key to FRA's ability to manage its workload and oversight responsibilities. In conclusion, today, almost a decade after the tragic rail accident in Chatsworth, California, it remains an open question whether railroads and FRA are poised to complete the remaining work and overcome the ongoing challenges facing them to achieve full PTC implementation by 2020. Chairman, this concludes my statement, and I would be pleased to answer any questions you or members of the committee have.
Thank you. Mr. Nepperstick.
Good morning. I wish to thank Chairman Denham and Ranking Member Capuano for hosting this important discussion on positive train control. I am Scott Nepperstick, and I am Amtrak's Chief Operating Officer. I joined Amtrak in 2012 and currently oversee the 17,000 hardworking employees of Amtrak's operating departments. Our workforce does a great job, and I am proud to represent them here today. At this moment, Hurricane Florence is bearing down on the East Coast. And for the safety of our customers and our employees, we have adjusted our service and are making all necessary preparations to safeguard them and our infrastructure as much as possible from the impacts of this storm. Today, I will provide an update on PTC, including its operation on Amtrak-owned infrastructure, on other host infrastructure, and our tenants' PTC operations on our infrastructure. First, let me discuss our most straightforward scenario, Amtrak trains operating over Amtrak infrastructure. In this case, Amtrak plans to be fully PTC ready and compliant by the end of this year. We have developed a detailed plan for every portion of our network, and we're executing an aggressive yet realistic plan which will enable the remaining third of our route miles to be complete by December 31st. Second, I would like to discuss those places where Amtrak is a tenant on other host infrastructure, and in fact, 72% of our train miles are over tracks owned and maintained by other railroads. For those tracks, we are cooperating with our freight and commuter host railroads as they work to complete PTC installations. We are currently interoperable with 5 hosts, and we anticipate several more before the deadline, although this is dependent on host readiness. Places where the host PTC system is not anticipated to be ready for service by year's end, and if they have accomplished specific criteria, they will be able to apply for an alternative schedule. We expect this on 37 segments across our network, including all the portions where PTC is mandated by law, but not ready by the deadline. Additionally, the FRA permits railroads to seek mainline track exclusion addendums if the operation meets certain criteria. Consistent with our safety management system methodology, we have been conducting detailed risk assessments to enable us to develop risk mitigation measures to address those areas without a functional PTC system. While this risk analysis process and mitigation plan development is still underway, let me be clear that Amtrak's goal is to continue to operate all of our services over all our current routes come January 1, 2019. Exactly how we accomplish this will vary across our network based on the specifics of each route, but I want to assure the committee that, at this time, we believe we will have strategies in place that will permit continued operation until PTC or PTC equivalency is achieved everywhere. Third, there are several freight and commuter railroads that operate over Amtrak's infrastructure. For those railroads who may require an FRA extension, Amtrak will work collaboratively with the FRA and each railroad on a case-by-case basis, ensuring their continued safe operations. Amtrak's goal is for all our tenants to have operational PTC as soon as possible, but we are also mindful of the impacts that any disruption of commuter service may have and the potential resulting safety consequences. Thus, Amtrak is working with tenants who believe they may be at risk, and the FRA to explore through our SMS process how risk mitigation strategies could be applied in such situations until they are fully operable. Amtrak has worked for years to be ready for the upcoming PTC deadline. When 2019 arrives, we will have our track, computer, training, and locomotive PTC work complete, and we'll be operating PTC across all the tracks we control and across much of the host railroad networks. On January 1, 2019, we anticipate that 90% of our trains will operate with PTC protection along some or all of their routes. We expect the FRA will have granted the remaining portions an alternative schedule or an exemption. Given the difficulty of completing testing with so many freight and commuter partners and the potential for technical issues to arise during testing, Amtrak will be required to submit an application to the FRA for an alternative schedule to enable us to continue operating while we finalize testing of our system and the systems of our hosts and tenants. This alternative schedule is required due to the FRA's interpretation of the law that full implementation status cannot be achieved until all non-Amtrak trains operating on Amtrak's PTC-equipped lines are also PTC compliant. As previously mentioned, we'll implement mitigation measures for all those areas which will not have the operational PTC due to a host alternative schedule of PTC exemption. PTC is not a silver bullet, and railroads alone cannot solve all the safety issues that face us, such as grade crossing and trespasser accidents, which require efforts from local, state, and federal stakeholders. Still, we are confident that achieving PTC or PTC equivalent levels of safety across our network will be a major safety achievement. In fact, it is our goal to be the safest passenger railroad in North America. Thank you for the opportunity to appear here before you today, and I welcome questions.
Thank you. Mr. Hamburger, recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Schuster, Chairman Denham, Ranking Member DeFazio, Ranking Member Capuano, and members of the most important subcommittee in the House of Representatives. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss positive train control and progress on implementation across the U.S. rail network. My focus today is specifically on AAR's Class 1 freight railroad members, their significant progress to date, and the remaining technical and operational steps necessary to fully implement PTC nationwide. Of course, a big piece of that task is establishing interoperability with Amtrak, as Mr. Naparstek has just outlined. I want to assure the committee that all hosts are working diligently with Amtrak to achieve just that. Chairman Denham, your opening statement was spot on. This is a life-saving technology, but it is indeed complex and daunting. I'm pleased to report that on all fronts, the Class 1 railroads have made tremendous progress since this committee last convened on the topic in February of this year. At the end of July, the vast majority of installation has been completed. 98.2% of locomotives, 99.2% of wayside interface units, 99.1% of radio towers, all equipped and installed, and in addition, 99.8% of required employees had received their training. Furthermore, by the end of July, the Class 1 railroads already had in operation more than 37,000 route miles, or nearly 70% of the 54,000 total required by law. PTC development has been an immensely complex undertaking from day one. From the start, the railroads focused on developing and testing technology that would meet the RSIA requirements, especially nationwide interoperability. This required developing essential software and hardware. Once developed, rigorous and repeated testing is the only way to ensure this system works as intended. In addition to initial testing in a simulated environment, these components must be installed and exposed to day-to-day operations to verify that each individual part and the system as a whole will function properly under real-world conditions. And as Scott has just pointed out, those real-world conditions can be very challenging, as we're seeing in the Carolinas today. The freight railroads operating there are working with emergency responders and the governors to be ready to move in and help in the aftermath after Florence hits. In addition to the failure of a single PTC component can mean that the system shuts down a train unexpectedly and unnecessarily. When that happens, it means trains are not able to operate normally on affected rail lines until the failure is corrected, a situation railroads are currently facing as PTC is rolled out. Additionally, it is common for one railroad's locomotives to operate on another railroad's tracks. Therefore, PTC systems must be fully interoperable across all of the nation's major railroads, adding yet another layer of complexity. Ensuring this interoperability is the largest step left to full PTC implementation. Class 1 railroads are up to the task, making consistent progress, and continue to resolve issues as they arise. In the future, by the end of 2018, each Class 1 railroad will have completed PTC installation. 100% of wayside, back office, and locomotive hardware will be installed. 100% of spectrum will be in place, and 100% of required employee training will be complete. In addition, it is projected that by the end of this year, 80% of Class 1 route miles will be in operation under PTC. This compares to the target established by Congress in 2015 of 50%. While some Class 1 railroads plan to be fully operational by the end of the year, all Class 1 railroads will be 100% implemented no time later than sometime in 2020. As Mr. Naparstek has pointed out, even if a railroad will have PTC fully operational on its network by the end of this year, FRA will not consider the railroad to be fully implemented until all railroads, the host and all of its tenants, are fully interoperable. The bottom line is that every day, as railroads finalize the PTC installation and expand PTC operations, the risk of accidents on the nation's rail network is reduced, passengers move more safely, and employees operate in a safer environment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hamburger. Mr. Kneppel.
Good morning, Chairman Denham, Chairman Schuster, Ranking Member Capuano, Ranking Member DeFazio, and members of the Subcommittee on Railroads, Pipelines, and Hazardous Materials. On behalf of the American Public Transportation Association, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the state of positive train control implementation in the United States. My name is Jeffrey Kneppel. I am a professional engineer and serve as the General Manager of the Southeastern Pennsylvania Transportation Authority, or SEPTA, the nation's sixth largest system, providing more than 1 million daily trips throughout southeastern Pennsylvania. I'm also chair of APTA's Commuter Rail PTC Subcommittee. As we sadly recognize the 10th anniversary of the tragic Chatworks accident this week, I want to begin by reiterating APTA's and the commuter rail industry's commitment to implementing positive train control. The nation's commuter railroads have been working continuously with our freight partners, third-party contractors, Amtrak, and the FRA to address financial, technological, and logistical challenges as the industry works towards a common goal, implementing positive train control and making an already safe system even safer. And I would like to note that it's 18 times safer to take the train than drive. Since APTA last testified before this subcommittee in February, commuter railroads have continued to make strong progress. This improvement is reflected in the FRA's second quarter PTC progress report, including reducing by 2 the number of commuter railroads on FRA's list of at-risk railroads. And we expect the number of at-risk railroads to continue to drop. Although no two PTC experiences are the same, I offer the SEPTA story as a positive outcome based on a good plan, a supportive board, and some good circumstances. I kind of break our PTC efforts down into 3 stages. The first one was construction and testing, and our plan was to do the work with both in-house forces as well as contractors. So our in-house forces installed automatic train control, while third-party forces placed the access overlay on top of that system. We also had a particular situation with CSX where both railroads wanted to run their form of PTC, and so we performed a separation project that was completed over a 6-mile stretch in August of 2015, and I would like to note that we really appreciate the Tiger funds that were utilized for that work. Stage 2 was placing routes in provisional revenue service, and we began in April of 16 to start placing our lines in revenue service, and we did that first on our Warminster line, which is a single-track line. We incrementally rolled out 1 or 2 lines a month in our territory until January of 2017. At that point, we intensified our field testing efforts on Amtrak and ran from January until May of 17, when we began operation with PTC on our 3 Amtrak territory lines. So since May of 17, all 13 lines have been continuously operated with PTC. That's SEPTA vehicles. And that leads to the stage 3 where we're at right now, and that's interoperability. This significant challenge remains. CSX and Norfolk Southern are scheduled to be completed by the end of the year, but this could be a photo finish for one of the carriers. It has not been easy, even though our progress appears strong along the way. Funding was very difficult for SEPTA. The economic collapse of 2008 and other circumstances put us at our lowest historical capital funds. Fortunately, that in our state, Act 89 was passed, which helped SEPTA through a tough time. Employee retention and continuity was a challenge, a limited vendor base. There were countless innovations needed to overcome technological hurdles at various points. Car shortages during our equipment installation, endless testing, a formidable training effort. We did experience a very significant radio interference issue with freight carriers. There was obviously startup inertia and struggles, and poor on-time performance until schedule changes could be made. But we persevered through this. We've spent $344 million on this project, and I am proud of the efforts of our entire organization. Thank you for this opportunity to testify on the challenges and the successes of implementing this critical safety system, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Knupple. And now, Ms. Mortensen, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Schuster and Denham, Ranking Members DeFazio and Capuano, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for holding this important hearing and inviting me to testify about our experience implementing PTC on the smallest commuter rail service in the country. First of all, I want to note our sincere appreciation for our congressional delegation, for our service area, especially the ones who serve on the House T&I Committee. Chairman Denham, Representatives DeSaulnier and Garamendi have done a fantastic job for our constituents, and we're very fortunate to have them on this committee. Second, I also want to thank the Class 1 railroads who are our host for both our ACE service, which I'll talk about today, and the San Joaquin Amtrak service, which we manage. They have been incredibly collaborative and helpful to us on the PTC, as well as our goals to expand services out in Northern California. Just a brief bit about our agency. We operate under a consolidated staffing model that allows us to be very agile. We're a very, very small agency, and we manage both the ACE Commuter Rail and the Amtrak San Joaquins. And we throw our heart and soul into both. We have 2 policy boards that can take care of the constituents in each of the communities, but we share one staffing so that we can leverage opportunities, have very good cost controls and cost efficiencies, and bring more rail service, regardless of whether it's intercity or commuter, to the communities that we serve. The Amtrak San Joaquins run up and down the spine of California, north and south, and our ACE trains connect that spine from the Central Valley into the Bay Area. Our small rail commission is headquartered in Stockton in San Joaquin County, and while we don't have very large budgets, we really make the most of what we have with our local partners. Our state just gave us a big vote of confidence in investing $1 billion in our program of state funds to help us expand more service up to Sacramento, the state's capital, and further down into the Central Valley. And we are tasked with delivering that within the next 3 to 6 years. So we are used to daunting tasks. We have just 4 ACE trains that operate in the commute hours between the Central Valley and the Silicon Valley, our big job market. But on 3 of those 4 trains a day, we're carrying over 1,000 people each way. That's a very congested train situation, and we realize safety is paramount. We're also celebrating our 20-year anniversary, so while we are the smallest, we're not the newest kid on the block. And we've made do mostly by funding from local transportation sales taxes in each of our service counties. We've really found that self-help is a necessity when running a regional rail program. In addressing the topic of today's hearing, I'm here to represent to you, and I know we are on the list of 9, that our board and our entire team is more than 150% committed to safety in many ways, including PTC. We have undertaken all the steps possible for us and will continue to take the final steps necessary to fully implement the PTC program by the deadline. But I do want to be very direct, and especially in a response to the opening comments. We have had some challenges. Some we've worked through, some we are continuing to work through, some are out of our control and frustrating, but we continue to push ahead. While being the smallest does have its advantages in terms of agency flexibility and agility, our responsiveness out in the service territory, and very close access to our customers, in a national process where we are vying for the attention of a single vendor and manufacture of the PTC equipment, we find ourselves sort of pushed towards the end of the line. We really have faced the situation of being at the mercy of the marketplace. We operate our trains on the host railroads, so our only requirement for the ACE trains are the PTC implementation on 6 locomotives, 8 cab cars, and setting up a back office server. Now, we also have the responsibility of the crew training, of course, but we have a somewhat limited role in terms of our compliance requirements. Our PTC equipment was ordered in March of 2017, well in advance of this year's deadline, well in advance of being able to work with our host railroad partners on the testing. But because of the many other orders and important orders across the country, the equipment was not delivered until April of this year, so a year and a month after the order. And then it was difficult for the vendor, as was mentioned before, to establish a site workforce given the demands. This week, 6 of our locomotives, of our total 14 pieces of equipment, that's 42%, will be fully outfitted. That's as of today. We're on an expedited installation schedule, so all units will be completed by mid-October. And our test trains begin field testing on Saturday, October 6th. That will continue through into RSD through the end of December under Union Pacific's testing plan. I'd like to give an example of how Union Pacific is helping us out. Since our equipment is not fully installed, they helped expedite us getting a desktop simulator that will help get our engineering crews into at least the desktop training sooner so that they are already well ahead of the game once the equipment is out in field testing. Our back office server has been approved by UP, and we're ready to start configuring all the equipment with the slot 10 cards as soon as the testing units are validated. So we've been trying to be very forward-moving and very proactive in our implementation. And I know your question is, why has it taken so long to get to this point? And I guess it's good news and bad news. Issues that have arisen for other properties who do have the resources to do the R&D testing and work out the bugs, those sort of cascade onto us. So I'll give you an example. The radio antennas, which are common to everyone, they began to fail due to water intrusion for other agencies that were using them. And so the antenna was recalled. So we already had our service kits ordered with the old antennas, with the cabling, and we'd already installed some. So we were unsure about the priority for us getting the new antennas since you had operating systems that were failing. So rather than wait for that, we continued with the installation of the old antennas. They haven't failed yet, and out in California, we're not in a water intrusion situation. So we just forged ahead with the old antennas. We will replace them when the new antennas become available to us down the line, as they will at some point. But it's an example of how we can be a little bit innovative and just keep making this thing work, regardless of what the challenges are. On the Amtrak San Joaquin side, I'm happy our partner Amtrak has taken the lead. They made a big equipment purchase a little bit after we did, and I think they sort of got in front of us, but that lets us have one of our systems out in the corridors testing already, and I'm confident the San Joaquins will be compliant. And I guess a benefit of being last in line, we have taken advantage of the lessons learned. We have taken the resources that the FRA has offered. Both FRA DC, FRA District 7 have been great to us throughout the process. Our operating contractor from Herzog, who's been our contractor for 20 years, he came from the North Star property and has been through the PTC process, so he is helping us expedite, and he is firm in his commitment to me that the ACE service will meet the deadline. We've also had other partner agencies offer us some equipment if we have some trouble, if anything malfunctions, and we're thankful for that. So with everyone rowing the boat this hard, I believe we will meet the deadline. And we look forward to adding our name to the list of agencies that are in PTC operation, and we get off the list of 9. And I thank you for the opportunity to share our experience today and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Mortensen. Appreciate you being here. When is Caltrain scheduled to upgrade the 4 miles of track that ACE operates over?
Caltrain plans to begin testing a segment by the end of this year. It will not be the segment that is for the ACE and the Capital Corridor down around San Jose. So they will begin testing, but not in that section. So that's anticipated, I think, in the second quarter of 2019.
So if you're unable to certify that area for PTC, how does that affect your deadline?
So we are a tenant on we're a tenant on both railroads. So we will fall under, they will file an alternative schedule for all the tenants, Amtrak, Capitals, ACE, and UP. And so we will fall under that.
So they'll file for the extension. Correct. You're not required to do so.
Correct.
Thank you. Mr. Neppersteck, in your testimony, you talk about 605 of the 901 Amtrak-owned route miles have at least one wayside PTC system installed and operational. What are the biggest risks to not completing the remaining third of Amtrak's routes by December 31st?
The largest risk at this time, I would say, is the interoperability testing in terms of the time it will take to run the test trains, to evaluate the test results, submit and get approvals. So in each of the areas we run, and we cover a vast, a lot of territory, certainly on the Northeast Quarter, Michigan, Chicago, et cetera. Each one has a little bit of a different risk pattern. But where we are, and based on the fact that a lot of what we're looking at now is doing interoperability testing. For instance, on the Northeast Quarter, and I think it's been mentioned, until all our tenants are ready for interoperability testing, we can't complete, we can't be 100% complete. And we have tenants on various phases. We have Mr. Knuppel's organization, who I think is much more advanced than certainly other commuter agencies. So working through the whole interoperability, I think, is the biggest risk right now.
How far are you on the Northeast Corridor?
We plan on having all route miles where we control PTC ready and compliant. So we should be ready ourselves on the corridor, and it will be a matter, we will file for extensions, we will file for the alternative schedule, and then we will work with all our tenants to help them become interoperable. And in some cases, to be frank, I'm working with the tenants right now, my staff and I, to understand when they could be ready for testing.
You'll file for an extension on the Northeast Corridor as well?
Yes.
I would say that, I don't want to speak for Mr. Capuano, but we've shared a number of conversations about the accidents that we have both seen together, Philadelphia being one of those. And in 2015, this committee was promised that the Northeast Corridor would be 100% PTC compliant by the end of 2015. It's 2018 now, and we're talking about filing for an extension because we're still not there yet. I've got to tell you, it's one of the main reasons of frustration for this committee. When Mr. Sumwalt talks about the 29 deaths that have happened around the country, Amtrak is right there on some of those catastrophic accidents, Philly being one of the most. So it's with great deal of frustration that we continue to have this conversation and talk about extensions, especially when last hearing that we had at the beginning of the year, we were very explicit about who was going to need an extension and why. Mr. Batory, what is your strategy to enforce PTC implementation compliance after the 2018 deadline?
Thank you, Chairman.
I think just pull it closer. I think that one's...
Yeah, we're having a technical defect here. If I didn't know better, I think it was at a railroad and we bad ordered this thing. Very good question. Going into 2019, we will continue the plan that emerged during first quarter of 2018 with the urgency and the intensity that we have applied against that plan throughout this calendar year so far. We are already recognizing where there's violations and recommending penalties. That is our only, if you will, mechanism to entice more urgency and more effort towards bringing PTC to a resolve. But I would much rather see us attain the resolve for PTC through the constant communication and collaboration that we have demonstrated as a group of people over the past 6 months. We have made considerable inroads. This is my observation of the FRA when I arrived in regards to this particular initiative. It's a personal opinion based on the facts that were put before me. We definitely lacked within FRA a proactive organization plan with a sense of urgency. We were decentralized in responsibility and accountability. And I'm not just speaking of recent date. I'm talking over the last 10 years. Part of it from my observation from the outside. Now, was the FRA responsive? Yes. The FRA has always been responsive with this initiative, but it was somewhat ad hoc because of the decentralization. But we have a plan today. We started formulating that plan when the Secretary brought me on as a special advisor back in November of last year. It was formalized in January of this year, and I'm very pleased and proud of the people that I'm working with, both in the railroad industry, in other agencies, and in the FRA itself, of what has been accomplished. And we're going to do nothing less than what we've demonstrated thus far.
Thank you. Mr. Pretori, I'm out of time, but one of the questions that has come up as we've had PTC hearings throughout the years is what about the fines that at some point will be levied? I believe it's up to $27,500 per day. Are you prepared to deal with any of the rails that have fallen behind or ignored the mandate with a heavy fine?
What I have shared internally among the people that I work with daily, naturally the range can be anywhere from around, I think it's $853, $57 per violation up to around $27,000. At this juncture, when you have an initiative that's 10 years old and you see the amount of lagging that has taken place, why would you do anything less than the full amount?
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Capuano. Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. To Amtrak, Mr. Naparstek, back when we had a hearing in February, President Anderson said there may be railroads that operate over Amtrak Northeast that do not have sufficient PTC Commission rolling stock by the December 31st, 2018 deadline to operate normal services. Amtrak cannot permit non-compliant equipment to be used after the deadline. But you seem to have said something different. Can you explain that to me? Please, close to the microphone so people.
Our position is to work very aggressively with the FRA and with our tenants in order for at the deadline to have each railroad operating services as safely as possible. I want to make sure.
Yeah, but I don't want it as safely as possible. This was pretty definitive. We cannot permit non-compliant equipment to be used. Does that still stand or not?
We we expect every tenant that will operate on Amtrak. Amtrak will be 100% operating
that.
trains with PTC.
Right. But these are on your
We
track.
expect every tenant to be operating either with PTC or under an extension, under an alternative schedule.
Okay, so the statement should have been qualified at the time, saying not, so you're saying that if someone has an extension, the equipment's non-compliant, but it's not non-compliant because they have an extension? Okay. Interesting. All right. And then he also said, that obviously there will be carriers over which we operate who appear unlikely to achieve sufficient progress to apply for an alternative PTC implementation schedule by the year's end. For any route segment, Amtrak will suspend operations. How are we doing there? Are there people who will, are we going to have suspensions of service in certain areas? Are we going to have holes in the system?
At the point since the statement was made, there's been a lot of progress made by host railroads. As we evaluate where our hosts will either be operational or will qualify for alternative schedules. We are not anticipating right now that there will be a host that will not have at least an alternative schedule. Where we will run over MTEA territory or where we run over alternative schedule, we are applying risk mitigation strategies. We are looking at the territory and we are saying what additional risk can we do to close the gap. Our goal at Amtrak will be to be running PTC 100% everywhere we run. That is not a goal we will be able to achieve by 12/31, but we are committed to make that goal, and we will continue. So even over MTEA territories, we will continue to move forward with towards PTC. In the meantime, we'll use risk mitigation to move towards what we are terming as PTC equivalency, using other operational and technology means to close the gap.
Okay. Administrator Batory, I guess you're going to get a flood of extension requests, and as I understand, these are rather complicated and lengthy documents. I mean, are you, staffed up to the point where you're going to be able to process all of these by the 1st of next year, especially if some of them come in, in December? Yes, yeah, I think it might be working this time.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
We'll get it closer.
Yeah.
There we go. Now we're talking about the exceptions.
Well, the extensions.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to get you're getting a pile of both. Okay.
The extensions thus far, for instance, we have the ability to handle the alternative schedule requests within a timely period where we have a 90-day window. We have to go back and tell the applicant what the concerns are, if any, within the first 45 days, and then we have the remaining 45 days to get.
Well, if people submit documents on the 1st of December and you've got 45 days to send back concerns, do they qualify to continue to operate on January 1, even though you haven't?
Yes, they do.
Well, that's probably going to mean you're going to get a heck of a lot of people filing on whatever the last business day is in December.
You're exactly right, Congressman, and we've discussed that with the prospective to-be compliant carriers. We've talked about internally. We are going to be able to be responsive to the alternative scheduling requests. The one that is concerning that we may want to discuss later has to do with the certification of the safety plans.
Okay. All right. My time's expired. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Schuster, recognized.
Yeah, Mr. Batory, could you, I don't think Mr. DeFazio, I think is a great question, and I guess the answer I'm looking for is, do you have enough staff to meet those timelines? I wasn't clear on that.
We have a calendar that we have to respect and recognize.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Yeah,
I do want you to note that the NTSB does occasionally help the FRA.
I see that.
room's getting redone next year, and that will be
I trust that's-
include a new sound system.
I trust that's for the record.
Right.
Okay, okay. In regards to how we are staffed, we have 30 people that are assigned full-time to the administrative review of PTC. When we look at what we have in the way of talent among those 30 people, and that's the key, talent. We have a sufficiency rate of probably in excess of 80%. The other 20% are going through the learning curve. Now, we are also retaining third-party service providers. And as far as getting past this calendar year and into next year, the administrative burden that we're going to see facing ourselves, we feel comfortable with. I will add one thing, though, that I talked about earlier about FRA and how it polices itself. Starting early this year, we instituted a perpetual inventory of all administrative instruments that entered the FRA, was being handled within the FRA, and being sent out by the FRA concerning PTC. We defined timelines for ourselves as far as how much time we should give ourselves to respond. That has helped immensely because now we really understand what we're faced with. And we're maturing as every day goes on.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, could I add
Sure.
a perspective to that?
Sure.
We talked to all the railroads, and they, quite frankly, do remain concerned about FRA's ability to manage the influx of documentation. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we have 32 out of the 40 railroads that are going to seek an extension. So FRA is going to have to deal with reviewing and approving all that documentation. You've got substitute criteria, requests to initiate testing, RSD. Safety plan documents could be as long as 5,000 pages. There's been some moving of some resources, particularly with testing, and they've expanded some technical contracts. But it hasn't amounted to a substantial increase in resources. So we really think they should implement our REC, which is to come up with a more strategic, risk-based approach. It's not about getting to just December. It's not even about getting to 2020. This is kind of a game changer for the railroad operations and industry, so they're going to be in it for the foreseeable future.
Well, and you mentioned risk-based, and I know Mr. Pretori and I have talked about risk-based, and this is not the hearing to talk about this, but I think in the future, I won't be here, but I hope this committee deals with it. Not just the railroads, but industry in general. When you deploy technology, the railroads, this is a new technology. It's been extremely complicated. But once it's implemented, I think the technology is going to grow exponentially. And the FRA has to be working in collaboration with the freight rails to make sure that we're moving fast. Because I've seen so many times that technology is developed, and by the time the government gets around to saying, okay, there's new technology. So, Mr. Vittori, can you respond to that?
Yeah, let me also share this, and this was something that was enlightening to myself. It's one thing to live outside the tent, and it's another thing to live inside the tent.
Right.
When it comes to PTC, and this is a tribute to yourselves and all your colleagues in Congress, we have two statutes, one from 2008 and the one from 2015. The one in 2008 was 3 sheets of paper. The one in 2015 was 6 sheets of paper. We took that, okay, and we formulated regs. And we came up with 45 pages of regs. And then the rulemakings that percolated out of that was 190 pages. Implementation plans, which are things that are already behind us. Now, they have to be maintained. They're living documents. Represent anywhere from 150 to 200 pages with a lot of technical substance that has to be maintained going forward forevermore.
Right.
The one that gives everybody a concern is the safety plan, and I was astonished. And remember, my railroad in my prior life had to be PTC compliant. The typical safety plan, regardless of the amount of mileage or the size of the railroad, averages in excess of 5,000 pages of paper. Now, that might be surprising to some of you. Now, as a result of these symposiums, and this is where I think people get concerned. How do you administer 5,000 pages of paper? How much of it is substance and how much of it is fluff? Is it format over substance or is it substance over format? So as a result, and to put 5,000 sheets into perspective, it's one Xerox box of paper. So it's pretty heavy too. And that is what we're struggling with. Right. And what we have identified is there's a way in which to go after the substance and facilitate this process much faster. Now, when we had the symposium that I just referenced a moment ago, had 100 people in the room. The 100 people in the room were the experts of the railroad industry. I said, has anybody in this room written their entire safety plan? There was no raising of hands. I said, has anybody in this room read the entire safety plan? There was no raising of hands. Has anybody edited the entire safety plan? There was no raising of hands. Because it has been syndicated out within their respective companies or out to third parties, then put together and then sent to the FRA. And then when people see what they're sending to the FRA, they're astonished and they say, can the FRA really handle all this? And that's where we have now learned that we're able to look at these safety plans, give conditional approval. At this juncture, we've given conditional approval to a total of 9. 6 of the 7 Class 1s. The only one that hasn't gotten conditional approval yet, but we have it, is Canadian National. We have 2 commuter railroads, that's Metrolink and SEPTA, and then we naturally have Amtrak. So that's why I bring this to everybody's attention. Let's not make something out of perception. Let's talk about facts.
Right. Well, I think you get a great point. I've run out of time here, but I just want to make one final point. Again, that's a great point. You know, I've had this discussion, but I just want to say that you really give me great confidence that a guy comes from the operating world, comes to the government, and I've great confidence you're going to change things at FRA, and you've demonstrated here, right here in this committee room, when you had a problem with your mic, you didn't screw around, you reached over and got another mic and solved the problem immediately, and that's what it takes, I believe. So thank you very much. I yield back.
Mr. Capuano.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Again, I want to start out by recognizing the railroads that have done their jobs, which is the majority of them, at least heading in the right way, particularly the Class 1s. So I want to start there. At the same time, as I sit here, you've heard the chairman say several times, we've asked for years now, people come to him and tell us what they need. No one has. No one came and said we needed extra time. No one came and said we needed extra money. And the FRA didn't come and say we need more people. So I sit here thinking there's no reason that we should have anybody in this situation. And I sit here and I look at it. I think it is incredibly unfair to the railroads who have done their job to allow those that have not to escape this. The permanent exception you gave to somebody is unacceptable, and I believe if there's ever an accident on that line, that permanent exemption will be thrown out by a court of law because there was no authority to do it. Simple. And when that happens, somebody at the FRA is going to be held to blame. May not be you, it'll be somebody. And if it happens again, we've got another one coming in looking for an exemption because they don't have any money. Every railroad in the country could have made that excuse, yet they didn't. They came in and said, okay, we have money, we'll do this, we'll reprioritize our spending. And to sit here and say to somebody they have no money, here's my answer. On line 7 of your written response, Mr. Pettori, you say you imposed the maximum civil fine on 13 railroads of $27,904. Thank you. But you also say it's a one-time fine. 11 lines above that, you also say you could assess that fine for every day they're not in compliance. $27,000 one time is not the maximum fine. It's $27,000 per day, per railroad, every day. And that money could be then used to help those, including the ones who are fined, to actually reprioritize their spending. I got to tell you, I have zero sympathy for the handful of companies that haven't done anything. None. And I've said it before, and I'll say it again. It's only a matter of time until the next accident happens and someone dies. We've got NTSB, I believe your numbers were 29 deaths and $190 million. How much is a life worth? Apparently, it's $190 million. Well, guess what? That's not near what my wife is worth, not near worth what my children are worth. Maybe you don't value your families as much as I do. And again, I don't think anybody wants to. It's a business decision. The FRA has the authority, and if you don't have the authority, you should come to us, even today, and say, we don't have the authority to do this, we don't have enough people to do that, whatever it is, and we'll do our best to help you. But unless you do that, we have to presume you've got what you need. I also have to presume, since you've done it in your previous life, you know how important this is. There's no excuse not to do it. And where's the sympathy coming? How are you supposed to look at one of the Class 1 railroads who've done this, spent millions of dollars doing this? They didn't really want to do it, but they were told they had to. They finally realized, okay, we got to do it. Let's get over it. How do you turn to them and say, thank you for doing what you did. Thank you for reprioritizing your spending. But you over here, Music City, New Mexico Rail Runner, doesn't matter. You can go right ahead, keep killing people. It's totally unacceptable. I don't think you're going to find anybody on this side of the table who's going to accept that responsibility. I don't think you're going to find anybody that comes January, the next rail accident that happens after January, that they're going to sit here and say, not a big deal. And that's fine if that's what you want to do. I also think you got lawsuits coming. You got lots of lawsuits coming. And maybe in my next life, maybe I'll go back to practicing law so I can take a third of that fee. It's going to cost a fair amount of money. And you know what? There isn't a single person that I know of that wants a penny of it. They don't want to lose their loved ones. So again, I'm going to end where I started. I want to thank the companies that have done their job. I know it wasn't easy. I know some of them had to be pushed kicking and screaming. And again, I'm not trying to be a perfectionist here. I get there'll be some extensions. That's okay within reason. But there's a couple of companies that haven't done anything. And we've been down that rail before, and it's wrong. And I don't think this Congress is going to accept it any longer. I apologize for the rant, but what the hell? That's what I do. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Capuano. Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for being here today and taking the time to brief us on this very important matter. Mr. Batory, given that PTC connects trains, controls to wireless networks, is there any instance where a successful hacker could theoretically gain control of such systems to disrupt their functionality and even potentially cause a derailment? If so, what measures are being taken to prevent such a development?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, there are efforts that have been underway long before PTC, and we're fortunate that those efforts were underway before the development of PTC because we're capitalizing on the results of those efforts. Imagine our automated train control systems that we had in place throughout this country, all of our sophisticated computer systems and networks that we have within the railroad industry. We have teams of people within the corporations that work very silent but effectively in developing the software technology that's needed to monitoring prospective hacking as well as protection of hacking, and that is carrying forward into the PTC realm and has to continue to be maintained.
Just in terms of the overall threat landscape, do you feel like you're getting the information you need from the interagency, from all the stakeholders necessary to both understand who might be trying to penetrate systems and networks?
We have, I can only speak for myself personally. I have never sought, specifically who's attempting, but there have been attempts into other systems, non-PTC, and the railroad industry individually, as far as companies as well as collectively, has been quite successful.
Thank you.
Chime in there. It is a major concern for the industry in general, but for PTC in particular. I'd like to get a more detailed answer for the record, but I believe the data transmissions are encrypted, and I believe we have a very reputable contractor whose name I don't have at the tip of my tongue working with us to help provide that security. But I'd like permission to submit a more detailed answer for the record, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. Hamburger. And I'd like to follow up with you, and forgive me for being new to all of this. You know, the chairman has assigned me a lot of homework as the newest member of the committee, and I'm staying up all night to do it. But the FRA and FTA have awarded grants that have subsidized PTC implementation to the tune of more than $1 billion, correct? So much of this has gone into infrastructure that the freight railroads use and has thus helped defray any investment that the railroads would otherwise have to make themselves. Could you just sort of tell us why you think that this subsidization of a private profitable industry is justified? And not to stoke division, but especially when I hear often from AAR that, for example, trucking doesn't pay its fair share and things like that. I just would be interested in your perspective on that issue.
I'd like to get a little bit better understanding of that $1 billion. I believe most of it is not gone to the Class 1 freight railroads. I believe it has gone to short lines and to commuter roads primarily. So I stand by the AAR position that this industry has spent over $10 billion of private sector money. Going on by the end of this year, it'll probably be $11 billion, not subsidized, not taxpayer money, private sector money to meet this safety mandate. So if we're going to transition into the issue of modal equity, the matter is really how much of the trust fund comes from user fees and how much of it comes from non-user fees. In the last,
Mr. Hamburger, can I interrupt real quickly before Mr. Capuano leaves? I just want to thank him for his leadership on this committee. He has been somebody that not only have I worked very, very well with in a very bipartisan fashion, but I've learned a lot from him too. His passion, but his knowledge is a lot. And I'll tell you, I've even learned that not only can you buy a cheap shirt, but it's got a cooling effect to it. He is a fashion statement that we're all following. You're a good man, Mike. Mr. Hamburger?
I was in the middle of a rant there, Mr. Chairman. But let me just close by saying that in the past 10 years, $43 billion of taxpayer money has gone into the Highway Trust Fund, not user fees, to subsidize those people whose infrastructure is funded by the Highway Trust Fund.
Mr. Chairman, I had a whole line of questioning related to the utility of short-sleeve button-down shirts and them going in and out of style, but I will forego that. I would just respond by making the point that with freight in this country expected to increase by 40% over the next 30 years, you know, this is not a zero-sum game between different modes. There will be room for everyone to grow. Everyone has to have skin in the game. We need to make a public as well as private investment, and so I think we need to ask hard questions around what everyone has to do. And so, and particularly when it comes to the cyber vulnerabilities, I will look forward to the follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I'll be glad to follow up on the modal equity issues as well. And for the record, I was incorrect. It's $143 billion in the last 10 years, not 43. $143 billion of non-user fee revenue into the trust fund.
Thank you. Mr. Lipinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to start out with Mr. Vittori. We were talking about the safety plans that had not been submitted. So looking at the PTC dashboard, it looks like CN has submitted a plan, but it has not been approved yet. Is that accurate? And are you going to prioritize approving plans ahead of requests for extension so that those get done more quickly and that PTC can be started up on those lines? Are you going to prioritize approving the submitted plans, safety plans, over the request for extensions? I just want to make sure you're going to be able to get done, because
both efforts are going in tandem. And as far as the CN one, it is currently being reviewed, and there's some unique circumstances about that I would certainly share with you in the essence of time, but it's positive.
Okay, more general, I just want to make sure, as Mr. Schuster is talking about, we want to make sure you have the ability to move forward as quickly as you can with all this, because the requests, as you said, are going to come pouring in. Now, how much money does the FRA, grant money, does the FRA have still right now from fiscal year 17, 18 for PTC grants? I know some money went out in late August. How much more is there?
If I could, Congressman, let me characterize it this way. First of all, we have out the door, okay, among all the parties associated with PTC, $2.6 billion so far. Now, since fiscal year 2017, we had CRISI money of $63 million that went out during first quarter, and that has already been awarded. Much but not all was PTC. Then we also had the CRISI money that was identified strictly for PTC, the $250 million. That, as soon as that hit, we recognized that we had to do something different and get that money out as quickly as possible without compromising the due diligence that we have to administer in getting money into responsible hands. And we were able to get that accomplished within about 75 days, 75, 90 days. The part that was interesting about that, and I want to touch on, and I shared this with staff internally, I shared it with some of your colleagues. At this juncture, it was more about the calendar than it was the money. But we did webinars, which is nothing new for FRA by a standalone, but we sought APTA, we sought AAR, we sought other associations that said, get your membership on a webinar, we will help facilitate it so we can get this money into the responsible hands. It was undersubscribed. So as a result, we just issued a NOFO, I believe this week, to get out the balance that was not taken.
How long do you expect that to?
And we're going to try to get that done within about 90 days, again, if not less. Because
last one was very impressive, getting that out.
You have to get this money in their hands so that they can get the equipment purchased, get it delivered, and get it applied.
A lot of us have been talking about passenger rails, a big concern here. It's also, look, honestly, this is a tough one when it comes to, we want to make sure that commuter rail, especially, is going to get PTC installed as quickly as possible. But, question out there, are we going to be levying these big fines against commuter railroads who may not have the money to begin with, and that's why they are so slow in getting this done, and what will happen next? So, that's a question I think is a question. Do you have any comments on that?
Certainly do. Let me share a statement of fact. When we had individual meetings, eyeball to eyeball, with each of the 41 railroads, and at that time I was not yet confirmed, I was an advisor to the Secretary, I shared with each of them that I often sat on the other side of that table where they were sitting. So I asked for candor and thorough understanding of where they were with PTC. And money came up in each of those conversations, and only in 2 was money an issue among the 41 to-be compliant railroads. It was more about the calendar and can we make the calendar as far as physical installation and implementation of the equipment. Those 2 railroads was the Rail Runner in New Mexico and Caltrain in California. Other than that, there wasn't. Now, that does not to say that there isn't a railroad that wouldn't have taken a check that day. They all would have taken money, but none of them said money was an impediment.
Congressman Lipinski, if I could add to that as a small commuter rail property, I had to do risk analysis about funding the PTC program, and what we did instead was our state is very supportive in California of getting PTC installed. And so through state sources related to safety and security, we funded our $7 million PTC program. I worried just about the timing of federal grants coming out, that would be another one of those issues that's out of my control that would push when we could make the order of equipment. And so there are times when there's just the uncertainty of the grants added onto the uncertainty of all the rest of the program that we couldn't bear that risk. And so while the offer was made, we did go forward with state funding just because it had more certainty about when we'd have our hands on it and be able to get it to the vendor and order the equipment.
All right, thank you. Yield back.
Mr. DeSaulnier.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I admire your attire today. For the record, I paid $5.98 at Kmart for this shirt, so I've realized the wisdom of Mr. Capuano, and I want to make my comments in the same spirit of Mr. Capuano, but looking more towards the future. So, Ms. Mortensen, I've been around long enough to remember when you started. Memory serves me, there's like 175,000 car trips through that corridor right now. We've got companies like Facebook and Google anxiously wanting to write checks to improve that. We talk about doing the Dumbarton Bridge. So you're taking 2,000 people. So I'd like to make this comment, and if you could specifically add to this and come back to Mr. Batory. This reminds me of a FDA hearing in another committee. We've got people who want the FDA to do best practices and make sure they don't make mistakes, but they want them to get new inventions, in that instance in biomedicine, into saving lives. In places like the Bay Area and Philadelphia and urban areas, we've got this huge demand, mega trips, people spending 2 hours going both ways, it imperiling the growth of these urban areas where 65% of our GDP comes from. So we want to get it right, but looking forward, what do we learn from this? We can expect new technology, we can expect new innovation, but right now people are struggling with their day-to-day life, and it's impacting the national income if we don't get this infrastructure right. So, Ms. Mortensen, maybe you can, I know about your instance because Mr. Denham's constituents come through my former constituents when I was in the legislature. They're going out there to buy affordable housing. They're working as software engineers in some of the biggest companies in the world. They're taking 2 hours to go, but you're overprescribed. So what are things that you look at your situation, you could take more of those cars off the Altamont, off 580, and put them into a real world-class commuter rail system if we got our act together here at the federal level, and knowing that the state is ramping up, as you said, $1 billion just to that corridor.
Well, I think one observation I've seen about the Facebook issue, and I've been in transportation 25 years, this is the first time where we have flash mob population that ends up at one place at one time. It used to be when an industry would come in, it would take some time to develop the plant, a production plant, a steel plant, you would know how fast it would grow and how many employees would be there over time, and it followed a fairly predictable schedule. With the new tech firms in the Silicon Valley, there can instantly be 19,000 employees in one location, and that's not a unique situation. It's happening over and over again. Government has a difficult time responding so quickly to put the infrastructure together for something like that. And so I'm aware of the issues on the Dumbarton Bridge, a very valuable bay crossing that doesn't exist today. And I think public-private partnerships where we let the public sector take the lead and maybe push things through faster than the government can is a way to look at those kind of situations to solve it faster. We would definitely utilize the Dumbarton Bridge, but if we do the typical government study, design, build process, it'll be 35 years. Hopefully, there is a financial partnership between Plenary and Facebook that has about $1 billion on the table, and I think that kind of thing we should support at the federal, state, and local levels because capacity is critical. We have to solve our own problems within the communities, and then we have to negotiate with our Class 1 railroads. That's a commodity for them. We want our goods too, not just people movement. So it's a give and take on a lot of different fronts.
So, Mr. Batorian, I'd like to, in the context of Mr. Sumwalt, who NTSB came to your rescue there with a microphone, his quote was, "Every day that we are at risk of a mass casualty event because of human error." So here is the balance. And you said urgency. We've got these demands on commuters, their lives being affected. We want to get new. So what have we learned from this experience? How can we fix this once and for all? But going forward, make sure we're more nimble about getting new technology in place and out into the commuters' benefits.
Thank you for that question. It's just to speak on PTC first. It's been a 10-year journey, and
it's too long.
Exactly. What did this phone do 10 years ago? And that we're basically trying to put in a platform that we designed 10 years ago. So as a result, I understand that there may be some frustration and irritation about things that have taken place that evolved from the past. But I'm trying to lead this initiative looking through the windshield and not through the rearview mirror. And we have to go forward. We have to bring closure to PTC 1.0, as I call it, recognizing the calendar gives us as much latitude as 2023. But we can't wait that long. And if we get it done sooner, we can then have a more robust, efficient PTC system that will be less money to maintain and operate. It will have more risk reduction in it, enhancing safety overall. And when you start doing that, you take variability out of the system. And when you take variability out of the system, you create capacity. And that allows for additional organic growth. We see that both in the passenger side and the freight sector. But we've got to get this accomplished and quit worrying about the past.
But the key part, and this is for future hearings, is what have we learned from this experience going forward? So when you put the phone up, this discovery 10 years ago, we don't want to be here 10 years with some undeveloped, unknown technology now going through the same experience. There's a real demand and consequence for everyday people's lives if we don't get better at this. So that's the point of my question. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I might be so bold, I think what we've learned is that a mandate that is so specific is what is causing the problem. If the mandate had been reduce accidents by X percent, if the mandate had been reduce fatalities, reduce accidents per train mile, then the industry working with suppliers would be able to leapfrog technology, move forward, and I'm hoping that that lesson is learned so that once this platform is put in place, and it's a heck of a platform, that there are a lot of people in the Class 1s now sitting in, smart people. How do we take advantage of this to go to what I refer to PTC 2.0 and get additional safety benefits, additional operational efficiency benefits, but we're going to need an FRA and a Congress that allows us to do that and doesn't impede us from being able to do that.
Thank you, Mr. Hamburger. Mr. Bevan.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, witnesses, for being here. And this will be for Mr. Knuppel. Is that the way you say it? Knuppel? Knuppel?
Kneppel.
Knuppel. Okay. Sorry about that. Can you tell us about some of the commuters that are on track to meet the deadline and what they are doing that is making them successful in this implementation? Just give me a rundown, if you don't mind.
Sure. Obviously, I can give you our own experience, which sure. I talked a little bit about today. For a public agency, there's a lot of things that kind of have to break the right way. For us, we were fortunate in that we had an in-house signal construction already program going, and so we just were able to expand it. The fact that we were also able to use contractors and find a way to have both working at the same time was very good. A lot of people have been retiring in the last 10 years. At my company, I've lost just generally 25% of my employees in the last 3 years. Wow. And so keeping your talent and your team together is usually a big factor in how an agency will do. We do low bids. Low bids can work out. Low bids cannot work out. We're very fortunate with Hitachi and formerly Ansaldo, and they were very motivated and they worked well with us, and they were based in Pennsylvania, so that helped. For SEPTA, radio spectrum went very well. When we went to pursue it, the person was extremely reasonable and actually owned it, which made it a lot easier. Relationships are a big deal. With CSX, I can tell you that, you know, we had already separated on one of our territories with them, so having to separate again, it was just a follow-on. We did that separation project with them in less than 2 years, start to finish, and the Tiger funds were, as I mentioned, very helpful. But we had also a radio interference problem with them, and it got tough. But the relationships that we had, we ultimately worked through it. I liken it to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but we got through it. Amtrak was very, very instrumental in helping us, and their engineering group was based out of Philadelphia. So that was extremely helpful. And the FRA, you know, I think was been very, very helpful to us, and the administrators even come to me and sat in my office and made sure that I had what I needed and answered any questions, so that you know, your relationship with the FRA is important. Your workforce, you know, your train crews, it's a big change, and so the agencies that have a positive approach towards it and buy-in, that helps. And for us, you know, I had a very supportive board. We were at a very, very low time in terms of our capital funding, but our board was very, very supportive. And our riders, I can't thank them enough, because they knew what was going on. We were telling them, and it did affect them. Our on-time performance went way down. As we run every car we can every day. They're always asking for more cars on every train. And we had to take cars out of service to equip them, and they were patient, and they let us keep going.
I want to ask you one more question, though.
Sure.
If you can just go ahead and wrap up.
I'm done. So
You're
those
done.
those are kind of the positive things that came out of our experience.
Okay, thank you. And then, how much money have commuter railroads invested into PTC, and what is the estimated total cost?
$4.1 billion.
Okay.
And the funding that that has been made available to us is about 1/10 of that, and 80% of that has really only come since May of 2017. The problem with having the money come late is with the requirements of the funding. You often can't use it on contracts that have already been awarded. So that's what makes it difficult to have the money in most cases for commuters come later.
Absolutely.
But we're certainly making use of it wherever we can.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Ms. Hesty.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too salute Mr. Capuano and his short sleeve shirts. I wanted to touch on two topics, as I think the last one here, no, Mr. Weber is joining us. The first, as someone who represents Connecticut, I have to drill down more on the Northeast Corridor and serious concerns. There's been way too much loss of life. There continue to be delays on that, and safety is paramount. And the other is, I do want to, before the close of my 5 minutes, return to Mr. Hamburger's point about basically performance standards. And I think if we in America are going to have a transportation and infrastructure system that is state-of-the-art, we've got to figure out how to move much more nimbly. And I do want to return to that, because we saw that with NextGen. We're seeing that with this, and we are losing ground around the world, and we've got to figure out together how to stop pointing fingers at who's responsible and saying we have to redo how we get to fast, safe, affordable. So on the Northeast Corridor, Mr. Naparstek, I know, not everybody in this room knows, but I know the Connecticut lines are owned by the MTA, not Amtrak. So when you say how much, when you're talking about how much of that, of the Northeast Corridor, that everything Amtrak owns is going to be compliant, what is not going to be compliant? So what lines are, what portions are not going to be compliant, and how heavily traveled are those portions? Because the rails are actually owned in Connecticut, or owned by Connecticut, are owned by the MTA. They're not owned by the state of Connecticut. Are those all going to be compliant with PTC?
I believe, let me get back to you with specifics on Connecticut. And I actually have somebody on my staff who could easily answer that. But I believe they will be compliant. But I would want to verify that 100% in terms of Connecticut. If we, everywhere we run service in Connecticut should be compliant by 12/31/18.
All right. Because I have to say, for many of us, this is like Groundhog Day. I've been on this committee for almost 6 years, and we've been hearing about we're close, just give us a little more time, a little more time. And frankly, you know, I have to say the folks in my district are angry and worried and late to work, like a combination of all those. That's not a good combination. So you hear that frustration up here. That's because, and the chairman of the subcommittee has raised that, people have not come forward to say this is what we need, and to wait till the 11th hour. I mean, how is Mr. Batory supposed to go through on the 31st of December? This is like college, you know, paper being done all night and asking for an extension at, you know, 1 minute of midnight. It's not any good way to instill confidence in the writing public. And it makes it impossible for us to do our jobs of oversight. And that's really for everyone. I mean, don't wait. Tell us what you need, and we will try to work with you. Mr. Batory, I agree with you on those fines. I mean, you get people's attention. People and the Class 1 freights have complied. But if people are not complying, you change the business calculation if you're facing a big fat fine. And we did do that extension in 2015 because we wanted the money to go to PTC, not to fines. And here we are 3 years later, and it didn't work. So I think people say, take out the sticks now, because this is not working. We haven't succeeded in getting this done. So again, what is it going to take to get this done as rapidly as possible? We're not going to performance standards 2.0. We better go to performance standards. What exactly do we need to do right now to get this done as fast as possible? Is it fines? I mean, Mr. Batory, do you think it's fines? And I'm on a fast response. Do you think it's fines to get attention now?
That is definitely a tool in the toolbox. And as I mentioned earlier, I would like not to have to use that tool, but if that's the one you have to use in combination with everything else that we've now invoked, okay, I think we should do nothing less than that insofar as exercising that. But the main thing is getting the concentrated, concise, collaborative communication, and I'm going to speak to the Northeast Corridor, from Boston down to Washington, D.C. When we met with those 41 railroads, Amtrak was one of them. And even though we've read in the newspapers over the last 3-5 years that the Northeast Corridor has PTC in place, it has pepper spots and stains all over it where there's no PTC. They have done an excellent job this year in trying to get rid of those pepper spots and stains where Amtrak is in total control of itself. The next thing that became very apparent, we had to maintain nothing less than a dialogue of once a month on a macro perspective with Amtrak. We maintain a dialogue with them daily, tactically, on PTC. But they host a lot of commuter railroads. So as a result, it then became apparent that we had an absence of synchronization between the commuter railroads and Amtrak. And the only way you're going to get that resolved is communication, and you can never have too much communication. So as a result, with our monthly meetings now, we have basically, we don't ask people to come to Washington, but we allocate whatever amount of time, it's usually about 15 to 20 minutes, for each individual commuter railroad to express on the monthly call where they see issues with Amtrak and where Amtrak sees issues with the commuter railroads, so we can get them in sync and get this PTC piece in place. It is a very densely operated piece of railroad that doesn't lend itself to absorbing a lot of variability because of its density, and we have to have this interoperability piece in place sooner rather than later.
May I add a perspective? I think one of the things that we need to think about is that only 8 railroads said they're going to make the December deadline. So 32 are seeking an extension. Of those 32, 12 would like to use substitute criteria, particularly initial testing, and that's in the really early stages. And our analysis has shown that from initial testing to RSD takes on average 2 years. So if you do the math, we're concerned that some railroads won't even make 2020.
As long as people are adding on, let me add on, if I might, Mr. Chairman. Those people who are filing for an alternative schedule, I would argue, are not filing for an extension. They are filing on an alternative schedule under the law as written. Several Class 1 railroads and Amtrak were ready to be declared fully implemented by the end of 2018. But the FRA regulations stipulated that no one could be fully implemented until everyone was fully implemented. Therefore, the host railroad, whether it was a freight railroad or Amtrak, could not asked, but was denied being declared fully implemented because their tenant railroads were not fully implemented. And I think Mr. Naparstek is being kind to one of his tenants by not going further down that path. But it is important, I think, for this committee, and as I read some of the media outlets, for the media to understand that there were railroads ready to be fully implemented, 100% operational, and were denied that and were forced to apply under the alternative schedule.
Thank you, Mr. Hamburger. Final question, Mr. Weber.
If I could, I'm sorry, sir, but if I could answer Congresswoman Estes' original question. So for Amtrak tracks in Connecticut, we will be 100% in operation by 12/31. For CDOT, they will be PTC operable completely by the deadline, and Metro North will be filing for an alternative schedule.
Thank you. Mr. Weber, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Gosh, I don't know where to start. Mr. Vittori, quick question for you. I was here earlier and had to go to another hearing. You mentioned, and I've been on this committee now, what's this, my second year. So you mentioned there was 2 laws, 2008, 2015, and some of your remarks. And then you went through, 2008 was 4 pages long, and then you went from there to the number of rules, and from there to the safety thing. Can you give me those stats again? Do you have them handy? I'll come.
Yes,
got them?
yes, Congressman, and just to give you some color as to why I sought this, when I heard that safety plans were 5,000 pages, I was a little taken back. So I said, well, let's peel the onion back. What got us to 5,000 pages? So I said, well, tell me how thick was the statute that came out of Congress? In 2008, it was 3 pages. 2015, it was 6 pages. And then the RSAC process was engaged to develop the regs, and we came up with 45 pages of regs, and that percolated 190 pages of rulemaking, which then drove the implementation plans that are not that burdensome, but they're living documents and have to be maintained forevermore, 150 to 200 pages. But then you get to the safety plan, and it's 5,000 pages.
Okay. So in those rules and all those pages that you cited, Mr. Hamburger makes a very good point. There was no provision for tenant rail lines, I guess, railroads. And I'm not quite sure how to provide for that because, you know, it's true that Amtrak may be on board, for example, but if you've got tenants responsible, are they to be held liable for their tenants under those rules?
Here's what evolved. There's 3 railroads, and the facts are there, so I feel comfortable in revealing them. You have 2 commuter railroads that are extremely far ahead of the curve, Metrolink and SEPTA. The 2 Class 1s are Burlington Northern Santa Fe and Union Pacific, as far as maturity into PTC. Burlington Northern Santa Fe realized that they were going to have their entire railroad PTC equipped, their locomotives are equipped, okay? So naturally, if you're working at Burlington Northern, you'd say, well, I'm done, okay? But they have thousands of miles on their railroad that they offer, okay, for use by tenants. Some of them utilized by Class 1s. So as a result, they wanted to be recognized as fully implemented. And we said you can't get fully implemented because you have tenants out there that aren't going to be PTC equipped. And let's talk about Chatsworth. That was a Metrolink train and a Union Pacific train. A tenant and a host got together. So if you would have declared that piece of railroad had PTC been in effect back then and said you're fully implemented, but one of those 2 weren't equipped, you would have still had the crash. So that's why it was written that way. So what we told Burlington Northern Santa Fe, we said, all right, there's the rule, the reg, the law, but there's also the spirit and the intent of all that. So that's when we suggested get all your tenants to file for alternative schedule, okay? And then,
not an extension, but an alternative schedule, as pointed out.
Get the tenants to file for alternative schedule, and then we can recognize you as being fully implemented, recognizing those tenants are not fully implemented yet because they filed for alternative schedule. They elected not to when
Why?
we offered. I can't answer that. Burlington Northern.
Well, clearly they had no jurisdiction over their tenants.
I haven't put.
Well, that's to say you're making them responsible.
Yeah, yeah.
But
well, there's 2 things. There's
So
no jurisdiction, as well as you can't test interoperability on a tenant that isn't ready to test with.
That's a little
so we
tough.
can't prove 100%. We are 100% ready, but I can't prove on Amtrak's system 100% interoperability without my tenants being ready.
That's a little tough.
Therefore, I need to work with my tenants, and we will be as aggressive as possible to get them PTC operable as quickly as possible.
I'm running out of time, and I'm the only thing that stands between this committee and lunch, so I need to hurry. Ms. Fleming, you said something that got my attention. You said that there was 32 of the 40, but that the others, the 8, were seeking an extension based on so that they could come up with, was it substantive criteria? Was that what you said?
Right. So within the statute, FRA has the ability to allow railroads to apply for, instead of meeting the current criteria for an extension, substitute criteria.
Oh, substitute criteria.
So 12 railroads, well, 16 are going to seek an extension using substitute. 12 of the 16 want to be able to have approval for initial field testing, which is really in the early stages. And my point was that for those 12 railroads, we're a little concerned that they may not even meet 2020, because at that juncture, you're still kind of working through a lot of bugs. The system may not be mature. And the railroads that are further along, such as my colleagues at the table, it's taken an average of 2 years from initial testing to RSD. So we're a little concerned that some of those railroads, granted sometimes extensions, your schedules work out fine, but sometimes there's unforeseen circumstances. So we're a little concerned about those 12 railroads and where they are at this point.
Okay. Well, I'm past my time, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your indulgence. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. Mr. Schuster.
Well, I just want to say a final note. Look, this is an incredibly complicated situation here. Deploying technology that's not fully developed, and we're going through the process. We've got some folks that are obviously the freights are ready to go, and you've got others that aren't. So this is incredibly complex. It should be a lesson to all of us about technology and going forward, no matter what the industry is, and how we have to make sure that, as Mr. Vittori said, it's got to be a collaborative effort. These companies don't want to have dangerous, they want to have the safest possible system they can have, and I don't believe anybody's trying to cut any corners, but it's just very complicated. So I just wanted to say that, but also I wanted to say to my good friend of 40 years, Ed, I did the calculation. 40 years I've known Ed Hamburger. He's been a great friend. He's done an outstanding job, I believe, at running for the last 20 years, AAR. You've been a great ally at times and have been a formidable opponent at times, and I appreciate that. And whoever has to fill your shoes at AAR has got some really, really big shoes to fill. So, but I wish you the best, and whoever comes after you, I wish them the best, having to go after Ed Hamburger. That being said, I'm not done yet, Mr. Chairman. I came here today because this is an incredibly important hearing, but I would not miss the final performance of Ed Hamburger. Now, I went through, looked at the testimony.
I'm delighted to hear that this is my final performance.
At least before this committee, I should say.
Chairman Denham may have different ideas, but anyway.
At least before this committee, at least when I'm here.
Okay.
Maybe Denham, I won't be here the next time. So, but I just wanted to say, I looked through the record. I tried to find some way to grill you today because of the name like Hamburger. Grilling you is absolutely appropriate. But I couldn't because I agree with you that the Class 1s have done their work, have done their job, and so we're in a situation here that, as I said, it's complicated, but again, you've done a great job over the last 40 years. I appreciate all of you being here, and again, we're going to continue to work forward, and I know in the able hands of Chairman Denham, he'll make sure that we all come together and we have a great ending when it all comes together.
Mr. Chairman, right back at you. Of course, you've been a great member of Congress, a good friend, and a great chair, and whoever follows in your footsteps will have a great legacy to live up to as well.
Thank you very much. And if I could ask you one more question, Mr. Denham. When I finish here, please do not recognize Ed Hamburger again, because he always tries to get into the last word.
Can you just say, well done, Hamburger?
Try it again. Great job, Ed. I yield back.
Last word of this committee is PTC, get it done. With that, if there are no further questions, I'd like to ask unanimous consent that today's record hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions may be submitted in writing. Unanimous consent that the record remain open 15 days, additional comments and information submitted by members and witnesses. With that objection so ordered, I'd like to thank our witnesses again today. If there are no other comments, the committee stands adjourned.